wish that was not the case, but I've been delighted and overwhelmed by the welcome that everyone has shown me. I wanted to particularly thank my dear friend Kamran Ali, who, if he summons me, I will go, and he summoned me here. And here I am, and the wonderful work he's done at LUMS. I've been part of an advisory board for the last 3 days, meeting all the wonderful faculty here. And it's been really delightful to hear about the kinds of initiatives that are in progress here. And also to thank Nida Kirmani and Omar Kasmani, who I met a few years ago at Michigan at a conference in Pakistan and learned a lot from their work, and was very excited when they thought of having me come here. And of course Aman Bucha, who I did not have the pleasure of meeting till I got here, but has done everything to make me feel comfortable. And of course many thanks to the Gurmani School for their support for this event, and I hope we focus on the plurality and have many more such events. I'm going to do my best to keep you entertained. I will not be showing you dirty pictures. I am, after all, a literary scholar who works in the historical archives, so I'm going to try to take you into the past and try to get you to think about why histories of sexuality matter for queer futures. So without further ado. To write a history of sexuality in South Asia, or so the story goes, is to embrace the chimeric prose of paucity and plenitude. If the present is marked by an inescapable surfeit of evidence, the past is haunted by an unremitting loss of materials. Marginality and loss, paucity and disenfranchisement, these are the hermeneutical forms that have become the common currency of histories of sexuality. The missing amphora of sexuality is recovered, particularly in South Asia, from the archival detritus of histories of slavery, colonialism, and nationalism to showcase more liberatory narratives of emancipation, liberation, and rights. Even scholars of pre-colonial histories of sexuality in South Asia, who rightfully bemoan the temporal focus on 19th century European colonialism, call upon a similar language of loss as they lament the post-colonial erasure of a historical archive resplendent with evidence of sexuality's past. This orientation to loss, mutatis mutandis, surfaces most vividly within queer sexuality studies in the West. When I say West, I mean the Euro-American Academy, where histories of sexuality are still tethered to forms of loss, lack, and failure in the face of, or rather because of, our embattled political horizons. So Jose Munoz, who the conference began with, was a dear friend of mine. We went to graduate school together, and we actually disagreed very much in the formulation of queer futures, because he wanted to draw potential from sites of failure, and I want to take you somewhere else. So it will be in some ways, hopefully, a conversation. Sexuality thus endures as an object of historical recovery, it seems, through a poetics of melancholia, an irresolvable longing for loss that eschews all forms of consolation. Now, to note the orthodoxy of such theorizations about histories of sexuality is to not dismiss the considerable productive thinking. If anything, it is more gestural of a larger critical ecology, as evidence and evocation of the collective pull of loss across geopolitical landscapes. After all, narrative economies of loss are always already at work in the worlds we seek to enter. Excruciating double bind that indentures us to the very historical holdings we seek to release. Queer subjects, especially in subaltern sites like India and Pakistan, remain in the stranglehold of constant precarity, even as they stumble towards pragmatic, entrepreneurial, and often legal structures of survival. So, for example, Omar mentioned the recent legislation around trans rights here in Pakistan, and its confounding paradox of not having decriminalized homosexuality. In India, for example, Section 377 was recently repealed, and we had the Nalsa judgment, but both of those judgments have not done very much for the betterment of queer lives, right? So that's the double bind. We want law, but we understand that it doesn't promise us or redeem us in any way. So indeed, any epistemological privileging of loss, past or present, assumes, if we continue to harp on this narrative, an eventfulness that flounders in the face of the ordinary, chronic, and cruddy syncopations of everyday subaltern life in South Asia. I don't think there's anyone in this room who would say there isn't loss. But what is loss if we stay with it? My talk today challenges such a preoccupation with loss as the structuring mode of narration for histories of sexuality. To fix sexuality within such vernaculars of loss, while politically exigent, is to refuse alternative historiographical modes, to bypass imaginative histories of sexuality full of intrepid archives and acts of invention. I want to set the two terms history and sexuality both alongside and athwart one another to tell a different story, one that seeks to discover what each of these terms might do to each other without assuming a position of negation from the outset. At its most ambition, my talk invites two sets of meditations that speak to the summoning of radical queer futures. What if we are to shift our attention from the recuperation of sexuality as loss to understanding it as a site of abundance? What are the archival forms and effects that emerge from such a coupling of sexuality and abundance? To enter queer histories and futures through an imaginary of abundance is not to invest in and stabilize a new knowledge economy of plenitude, or to slide into plodding literalization. Oh, we have more, mislaying in the process the messy misalignments of the concept of abundance. Bypassing salvific modes underwritten by loss as value, abundance for me serves more as a theoretical than descriptive supplement, as a concept metaphor that moves us away from the incessant shuttling between the sated fulfillment and avid impoverishment of historiographical ambitions. Vulgarly stated, the concept of abundance I am proposing does not replace paucity with overflow, but rather unravels a set of discourses that are fertile ground for producing and contesting attachments to loss. To speak of a history of sexuality from the sideline of abundance, particularly in South Asia, is to emphasize both the efflorescence of the past and to attend to its strategic and active unassimilability within the politics of the present and the future. One way to pass the concept of abundance I'm proposing here is to see it as inextricably linked to the histories of subordinated collectivities. I work on histories of caste and sexuality in India and Pakistan, as a historiographical orientation that challenges the narratives of their constant devaluation. What historical forms does abundance take when we turn to subaltern pasts and depots? How do such forms of abundance fall outside historical interest and preservation? How might a turn to abundance work against the imperative to fix sexuality within queer futures of vulnerability, damage, and loss? Let me turn now to two such archival events. July 14, 2008. You can ignore that for a minute. I'm very fascinating, forget about that. I will remind you when it is time to look there. July 14, 2008. Tumhi kai karta, madam? What are you doing, madam? This was the question that the caretaker of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj archives in Paniji, Goa, an enormous private archive for materials on lower caste Devadasis in colonial Portuguese India, quizzically asked me as I painstakingly placed a fragile document into one of the many Ziploc bags I was carrying. Devadasi is a Sanskrit term literally meaning slave, dasi, of a god master, often read as interchangeable with terms such as courtesan, sex worker, prostitute. Bemused by my attempts to preserve archival materials that I perceived as being damaged or open to loss, they were literally crumbling in my hands, the caretaker's question signaled an unforeseen twist in my orientation to archival research. For her, the preservation of these rare materials was of little consequence. After all, as she sternly reminded me, this is an oversaturated archive, so full as it seems that it struggles to maintain the constant production of new and diverse materials. Here, the return to a history of sexuality was not through a call to loss of objects or materials, but rather through ordinary surplus. When asked about the potential loss of vulnerable historical materials, the response from the archival custodian was one of mirth and consternation. For her, the risk of loss is more a laughable matter, when the preservation of rare archival materials is of little consequence. In contrast to the imperative to immure and preserve material, these archives appear instead to be focused on the sustenance of an archive, whose abundant productions negotiate a different sideline to futurity. 4 years later, July 20th, 2012, a woman rushes into the Mumbai archives. Remember, we were in Panji in the first, in Goa in the first. A woman rushes into the Mumbai archives of the same Gomantak Maratha Samaj. A sheaf of papers in her hand, the woman frenetically approaches and demands to see the chitnis, the secretary of the institution. She is in urgent need of a letter of certification, a written affidavit from the Samaj that can be used to enable her young son to procure an OBC, an other backward caste certificate, so that he can attend university on a seat reserved for lower caste communities. You have the NOP category here for the same thing. Now the secretary arrives, listens patiently to her request, and gently reminds her that the letter from the Samaj no longer carries much legal weight due to the stricter regulations on caste verification materials. The rise in cases of false caste certificates, he tells her, has made collectivities such as the Samaj suspicious record keepers of caste histories and open to charges of caste fabrication. After all, he tells her, we have trouble proving who we are. Yet, the woman insists that a letter authenticating her son's lower caste status will help, and so the secretary pulls out the requisite form and begins to fill out the necessary information. But surely, the woman asks, you must want to see my son's birth certificate. Surely, she asks, you must want some evidence of my claims. Ah, says the secretary, we don't need to see any evidence, nor any papers. All we ask, he adds, is your permission to list your name in our annual published record of members. Amchi karani tumsa vishwas. We make, you believe. He notes with a wry smile. The woman listens to the secretary's request, pauses, gathers her papers, and quickly walks out the door. No caste certificate is exchanged. Now the first story is about habits of archival recuperation, my desire to preserve these materials. About found archival objects that are so plentiful that one must look askance. It's a laughable matter if you want to preserve. The second story is about evidentiary claims, the compensatory economies of archival formation, and the imaginative yet transactive refusal of such prescriptions. We make, you believe. Yet, the two stories are equally about the demand for archives to serve as guarantors of presence, rights, representation of queer futures, rather than places of epistemological liveness that are often ordinary, efflorescent, and often unreliable. But before I say more, I need to bring you closer to the archival stages on which the action unfolds. What and where are this subaltern archive that eschews loss and courts imaginative kinship? But first, before I go there, it is important to note that Devadasis, remember Devadasi is a compound term that means slave of God, but is often interchangeable with courtesan and prostitute. That Devadasis have become privileged objects of study in South Asia. When I say South Asia in this case, I mean India and Sri Lanka. And feminist and state efforts to excavate sexual difference in India's past. Devadasis, as I've noted, are often familiar and sought after objects of historical recovery within studies of sexuality and gender. Rescued from the detritus of history, Devadasis are repositioned within larger redemptive contexts of artistic and legal recuperation. So for example, if you follow Indian dance, like Bharatanatyam, a lot of Bharatanatyam dance scholars will recuperate Devadasis and say they weren't prostitutes, they were really producers of dance. Now what's interesting about the community I'm going to tell you about is that they don't refuse those connections, they embrace them even more. Now, if the restoration of the Devadasi has been tethered to archival forms of paucity, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, the archive that I began with, on the other hand, denaturalizes any such understanding of the Devadasi's customary forms. Gomantak means Goa, Maratha is a general term for Western India, Samaj is a Sanskrit Hindustani word for collectivity or group. Now the Samaj, this is Bombay Presidency. I did my first book research in Karachi. Remember, Karachi is also part of Bombay Presidency in the 19th century. So I'm writing about that very, very small corner of the Bombay Presidency, which was part under Portuguese rule, right? So many of you think about Goa as a holiday vacation, but it is much, much more. Now, available historical records provide a clear account of enslavement and labor by suggesting that these Devadasis were brought to Goa by migrating Saraswat Brahmins. So Brahmins are basically our bad people. We don't like them. And it's a generic term for, pick your favorite hegemon you love to hate. So these Devadasis were brought to Goa by Brahmins, originally to work on lands as slaves. So they're described as adavaktis, half-slaves, in censuses up to 1905. In these accounts, Devadasis were described as chattel. Unlike well-documented histories of social reform and rehabilitation that come from other parts of India, meaning British India, the Devadasis in Portuguese India underwent very little transformation and had even less exposure until the early part of the 20th century. These Devadasis were also known as Kalavas. Kala is art, meaning literally carriers of art. And unlike Devadasis in southern India, they were not wed to deities and were not prostitutes in any conventional sense of the word. Rather, these Devadasis were mostly female singers and sex workers, classically trained, placed through ceremonies like hat laune, literally touching hands, into companion relationships with both men and women. Portuguese colonial officials granted these Devadasis exemptions from existing anti-prostitution laws, as the women remained in structures of serial monogamy with their patrons through the lifetime of the Devadasi. Now, this is a typical album from any Portuguese propaganda of the time, and you always have in the middle a figure of uma bailadeira. I speak Gold Portuguese, so the Portuguese speakers here will sound different to you. So the Devadasi was often also referred to as a bailadeira. I'm showing you images because I want you to think about the archival representation of these figures as well. So this is from the Portuguese archives. We will turn to the archives of the Samaj in a minute. Now, Kalavans or these Devadasis were also crucially sworn to remain in the spatial proximity of temples. Now, one curious feature of such arrangements is that these women who had patrons who were Brahmins would have children. Now, remember, the patrons were men and women. So if they had children, they would take on the surname of the patron, which was a Brahmin surname, which they weren't allowed to have, even though they were lower caste. So as I was telling folks today, if you go to places like Goa, you will have people with Brahmin surnames, and the first thing they will ask you is, are you a real Brahmin or a fake Brahmin? Meaning, are you a member of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj? This is a huge thing in South Asia because caste and blood are huge forms of establishing kinship, and all kinds of lineage, right? So this is a very, very important thing. Now, for me, what is interesting, and I don't have time to talk about this in this talk, but I'm happy to say more, is that with the passage of anti-Devadasi acts, many of the members of this community moved to places like Karachi, like Mozambique, like what we now understand to be Sri Lanka and Burma. So it was a diaspora community. And for example, my mother's family originally came from Karachi and moved to India not during Batwara, but before Batwara. So it's a very important migrational pattern because they moved back to Goa, which was not liberated until 1961, right? So there are all kinds of ways in which this community was diasporic. And they moved back to places like Bombay in search of work in the newly envisioned Hindi film industry, where they could openly adopt their training and assimilate into society. Now, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj which are referred to as the Samaj, was established as a community foundation by these Devadasis and their kin in 1927 in Goa, Maharashtra and Karnataka. They are western states of India which share a common border, and officially became a charitable institution in 1936, moving back and forth between British and Portuguese India, roughly between 1860 and 1961. Remember, Karachi was part of British India prior to 1947. The 1902 census, for example, notes that there are 150,000 to 200 members of this community working and surviving in the various towns and villages surrounding Goa's capital, Panaji. The Samaj continues its activities to this day and has from its inception maintained a community of 50,000 to 100,000 registered members. Often referred to as Bharatatil Ek Aggressor Samaj, an aggressive community in India, this Devadasi diaspora is routinely lauded by the left and right for its self-reform and progress. From the immortal Mangeshkar sisters, Lata Mangeshkar, Asha Bhosle, to the first Chief Minister of Independent Goa, Dayanand Bandorkar, who was the first lower caste Chief Minister in independent India, there are few sectors of Indian society where the presence of the Samaj members cannot be found. Now, based primarily in Panaji, Shirora, Malvan and Bombay, which are small areas in Western India, the Samaj champions itself as caste reformist, describing its shift in name to Gomantak Maratha Samaj, a Goan Marathi collectivity, as a primary indication of its commitment to a progressive pan-caste politics. For example, they didn't want to be called Gomantak Kalavan Samaj, which would simply describe them as Kalavans, but rather Maratha, which would allow people of different castes from their community to work together. Now, I'm going to skip through because I want to get to an event. So they had many events that happened in the early 19th century, early 20th century, for example. The first official conference was held in 1929 in a small village in central Goa, and 750 delegates from all over Goa, Maharashtra, Karnataka and Karachi gathered to discuss the future of the Samaj. An extraordinary event given the difficulties of travelling between the borders of British and Portuguese India. Sexuality featured heavily in all discussions of the reform as the structuring mode through which to forge futures. Indeed, the early absence of any collective involvement by the Samaj in resistant movements outside of their local interests speaks to yet another twist in the tale of the Samaj. So now what's interesting about this collectivity is that it's emerging in the 1930s, where there are lots of anti-caste movements, a lot of movements towards secularization. So while this community is invested in reform, it has no interest in any other collectivities, right? So this is a little bit counterintuitive because we want oppositionality that's coalitional. Here you have oppositionality that's not interested in anything but itself. So if you think this is a hagiographical account, you have to wait a little bit for that, okay? Now, two extraordinary features make this Samaj noteworthy. It is unabashedly celebratory of its past and present, and it is the only Devadasi community that maintains its own extensive and continuous historical archive. Remember that I began with the past and the present as being continuous in the production of materials. Unlike the familiar economies of loss that accompany histories of sexuality, the archive of this collectivity offers a radically different relationship. It is important, for example, to note that there are archival registers of performance of all of these musicians that I mentioned, but they are mostly made by outsiders. Alternatively, the Samaj's own archives are messy, massive, and contain multiple genres of archival records ranging from minutes, journals, private correspondences, flyers, programs, wills, replete with the minutiae of everyday life in the Samaj. Most significantly, the archive is abundant, accessible, and continuous to this day. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because any one of you, if you have the misfortune to go to India, you can walk into these archives and ask for materials. They will give you a cup of tea and open the archives to you. This is an unusual feat, especially if you work in regional archives in South Asia where nothing is ever available. So the counterintuitive part of this archive is it's an archive of a minority community, but it's massive, it's abundant, and it's open. Right? So I've been working with these materials for about 10 years. I've only read about 40% of the materials. I'm going to show you a little bit of these materials, and then I'm going to turn to an event, so that those of you who are nodding off can wake up. So these are some of the materials. These are portraits taken by the Devadasis, which are self-staged, and they hand them out as visiting cards to their patrons, right? So this is a very typical Goan Devadasi image. Now this is, I'm sure, I don't know if there are any of you here who read Devanagari, but if you do, this is the first page of the Constitution and it has that weird quotation from Tennyson in there. But it basically says, Mata Karana Samaj Mumbai Sthapana 1927. Now, what I want to get to this. Now, this is a magazine that was published, started publication in 1927, continues to this day. So it's published every month and it has never stopped publication. Every issue has an image of a woman kicking a rock, and what is in the rock changes. So actually, if you see 1947, there's an image of Gandhi on the rock, because this community was not a big fan of Gandhi. Gandhi, as you know, had issues with sexuality. We can talk about it. Right? So it says Samaj Sudharak. Right? So their magazine is not called Gomantak Maratha Samaj, it's called Maratha. Samaj meaning we want to use our past of sexuality to reform everybody. Right? So this is one of the issues. Now, I'm going to show you some, so this is an editorial actually written by my father when he was 16 years old, and it's called Amhi Kaun, Who Are We? And he was the head of the Vidyarthi, what Vidyarthi ko kya kehte hain? Student ko kya kehte hain? Whatever, student. Acha, collective. And in this way, what is interesting about this, if you read Vidyarthi, is that he says, we are being encouraged. So nobody in this community is interested in finding their fathers, right? Because they don't know who their fathers are and they don't care. There's no Freudian romance here. But he says in this piece that we are being asked to love our mothers. So he says if we are being asked to refuse biological determinism, why are we forced to love our mothers? Why can't we choose who we love? So this in some ways is queer kinship avant la lettre, right? It's before the... So then I could go on and on and on, but this is just a wonderful ways of thinking some of these things. I'll show you a couple more then. I'm going to talk about this, right? Okay. So now you have a good sense of this, this community, right? Now bypassing the demands for recuperation, I must save in my Ziploc bags. Reproduction, I must get more people to read. Revision and reparation, we don't care. Amchi karani tumsa vishwas. We make, you believe. The Samaj's archives stubbornly demand readings that unsettle the foundational link between historical utility and archival preservation. The orchestrated refusal, for example, of the Samaj to conform to representational archival forms. For example, the Samaj does not have the usual veracity genres like biographies, etc., that you would find in the community's archive. They in fact have a lot of fiction, right? And I can talk about it anon. Now, embraces the very paradox it engenders. The archive remains a central value form. They have a lot of material, even as its radical transformation is continually demanded. Access to the Samaj has also meant, ironically, that they offer no lost cupboard of archival treasures to travelers seeking a historiography of discovery and recuperation. When I started doing this project, I had a lot of people, especially venerable brown men, who would come up to me and say, well, you know, you're so brave to write this history, and I would always say, you could write it too. Anyone can go and write these materials. And these figures are very well known, so it's not as if we're talking about a collectivity that people don't know about, right? Okay, let me turn now to one such example of make-believe within the Samaj archives. That thrilling dark night, Bandachi pi ek romanchakari ratra. A thrilling dark night of insurrection, 25th May 1921. It is 10 p.m. and we are under attack. Our house is being surrounded on all four sides, and I can hear loud cries and whistles as stones and rocks pummel our doors and rooftop. I run to the courtyard to see all the women and children huddled together in fear. As the attack escalates, the children began to lose control and defecate on themselves in fear. The women scream till their throats run dry, only to realize that there is no water left in the house. My wife, my lover, who is very ill, unable to bear the stress, falls to the ground in shock. I run to the rooftop with my gun in hand and shoot aimlessly into the darkness of the night, unsure if I am killing or will be killed. I scream out into the night, and suddenly the attackers retreat, and an eerie calm returns. Thus writes Rajaram Rangoji Pengarkar, the son of a Devadasi, or Kalavan, in the first volume of his much heralded autobiography, Nico, Who Am I? This is the only autobiography that's available in the entire archive. Now, the translation that I gave you is my compressed translation of a 10-page description of this event. And I was trying to, and those people who work in translation know part of the challenge is reproducing the tenor of the piece. The attack takes place in Paimien, a small village in the taluka of Konkona, southern Goa, a key stranglehold of the Goan Devadasi community. Once morning break, Pangarkar recounts the events of this halla, this attack, to the village headman who accompanies him back home to inspect and corroborate the damage done to his household. In due course, Pangarkar and his extended family of 25 Devadasis and their children and their lovers, remember they had male and female lovers, abandon their home and seek shelter in a neighboring village. There is, of course, as to be expected in any narrative retelling, a prehistory to the attack. 4 days earlier, on 21st May 1921, Paingarkar and his comrades hold a general Satyanarayana Puja, which is a religious ritual that celebrates Lord Satyanarayana, who's an avatar of Lord Vishnu, calling for a refusal of caste hierarchies and religious differences. An enthusiastic crowd gathers from 5 villages composed mainly of Doli and Bandi, which are the lower slave caste, a smattering of curious Portuguese officials, and a few breakaway Brahmins. Enraged by the repeated caste humiliation and exploitation suffered by the families at the hands of the Brahmins, the Devadasis demand an end to Brahmin hegemony and speak passionately. Yet despite all the excitement, no Purohit, no priest is willing to come forward and finish the puja. This description, or this description of the puja spreads, and the wrath of the Brahmins follows. Paingarkar and his larger Devadasi community are immediately banned from all social functions, their lands are confiscated, their businesses are shut down, and a general sanction is imposed against all of their interactions. Even worse, hundreds of crazy Brahmin youth are rumored to have taken up arms in retaliation and threaten and to attack and destroy Devadasis and their followers. There are signs that such anti-Brahmin activities are spreading apace as similar pujas against caste humiliation are said to be taking place. The scene then is of course set for the inevitable halla, the attack on the house of the Devadasis. Now after the attack, another extraordinary set of events follows. The Devadasis travel to Panjim, acquire legal representation, and submit a writ appeal to the Governor General Jaime Alberto de Castro Moraes. Now I'll shorthand this. So this is a very important event because they go to the Governor General and say, look, the Brahmins are oppressing us, we've taken our lands, and now they've attacked us. So this is a period in Goan history where it's relatively liberal. So the Governor General agrees to their demand and restores their lands, and the first official case against Brahmins around caste humiliation is filed. And the record of this case you can find in the archives in Portugal, right? So it's an official document. Now, but just as all of you and his readers are ready to settle into this rousing account of brave resistance, Paingarkar reveals an even more thrilling twist to the tale. In the opening gambit of the second volume of his autobiography entitled Me Gharavar Halla Ka Gadun Anla, Why Did I Stage the Attack on My House? Remember what the attack is written in the first volume, this is in the second volume. Paingarkar explains that the attack, the halla, was in fact a strategic drama, a Saubhadra Natak, directed precisely to protect and advance the interests of Devadasis. His words underscore the constant humiliation experienced by the members of his community. It is in this point, we are told, that Paingarkar, at the behest of his best friend and lover, the Devadasi Bhima, and in complete secrecy, persuades 6 comrades to attack his home on that fateful night. He stages the attack. The comrades are given detailed instructions about when they should attack, from what vantage point, and for how long. Each individual is asked to recite prepared lines explaining their whereabouts at a neighbor's residence should any of them be questioned after the attack. Not a soul is told of the carefully orchestrated attack except those directly involved. Remember, his own children defecate, his wife passes out, so it's a carefully guarded secret. Such secrecy, writes Paingarkar, guarantees the narrative heft of the attack as the heinous work of frenzied Brahmin youth. Bhima, the young Devadasi who serves as the director behind the scene, sets the stage perfectly for that fateful night of insurrection. Mobilizing established economies of rumor, fear, and humiliation, Bhima ensures that the larger village community truly embraces and anticipates the fiction of the attacks. So they go around the village and shoot guns and create the scene so that an attack by Brahmins is anticipated. Now, attack on Pangankar homes thus provides a necessary climax to such calculated and frenzied fear, so perfectly scripted are the conditions of its production. And the staging, as we are already told, does produce its desired effects. In addition to the case against the Saraswats, the Brahmins, the school was also established for the Devadasi community in Panji. Now, if you go to talk to anybody in this community, they all know this is a staged attack. But for the Portuguese state, this is the attack that they saved the Devadasi community from, right? So the irony is that in the legal record, this is an official account. In the account of the community, it's make-believe. We make, you believe, right? Now, does the revelation that I just told you, that this was so deftly staged, denude it of salvific value, or does its narrative veracity, but in fact, an event was being staged, inaugurate a different orientation to archival production? Let me explain what I mean. For anyone here who works within historical archives, it will come as no surprise that any hegemonic text making confidence claims to historical truth will be destabilized and exceeded by the operations of counter-archives. Counter-stories, sorry, so that's the second volume. So anyone who works with historical archives, it will come as no surprise that any hegemonic text making claims to historical truth will be destabilized and exceeded by the operations of counter-archives. Such a critical understanding, however, does not as easily extend to minoritized archives, where the subversion resistance hypothesis, despite or perhaps because of the contaminations of scholars such as Michel Foucault and the Subaltern Studies group, continues to function as difference's most consequential and enticing effect. Even the most rigorous intention to the contrary have not prevented the preservation of a veracity archive that promises even as the activity of its own demystification is rehearsed. What do I mean by that for my young students here? What I mean is that if you work in history and you find an archive and a record, no one actually believes that explains the whole truth, right? We know records are always what is left behind and what was, not what was. But even so, when it comes to minoritized communities, caste communities, regional communities, religious communities, we still demand records of proof of their existence, right? So even though we understand the paradox of records not being the truth, we still continue to demand them from certain communities who bear the burden of that representation, right? So I'm saying that's what we need to think about. For someone like myself, who is writing a history of these Govind Devadasis, this staged event provides an alternative historiographical model that refuses the stability of a legal record to hold or destroy, and focuses instead on the salvific form archives are asked to assume. In the case of this event, Pangankar disclosure cannily short of impugning the form from which it draws its historical archive. Rather, Pangankar's belated veracity expands the idea of an archive by anticipating its compensations, right? Pangankar knows he's going to get a house, he's going to get a school, he's going to get legal reform if he can have evidence of the fact that we are minoritized. And how do we get evidence? If we're attacked. We can't just be minoritized, right? So it's the compensations of the archive that are anticipated in the form of the archive itself. So he's not saying, I don't want archives, he's saying, let's make our own archives. Why do we need to rely on others? Any concern about the success of Pangankar's archival kala, meaning art, are easily diffused to the lavish praises biography garners from reviewers of the Samaj. So all people are reading his archive in his own community celebrate the fiction. They don't call him a fraud. They think, oh, we've got one on the Brahmins, right? This is an interesting moment. In so doing, Pangankar subjects the veracity archive to a crucial modification. He produces repeated evidence of the staging of the Halla. We're told how the scene is set, so that we as readers are asked to retool our foundational epistemologies undergirding historical recuperation. We are asked to negotiate the modalities of archival representation and recognition to document, as it were, the staging of a record. the ethical burden shifts away from the literal translation of the historical record to thinking more of its literariness, its kala, in making a history possible. I'm almost done. At this point, all of you sitting may well ask, how does an archival story of a staged attack in a remote area of Portuguese India provide both the mass and patina for a non-melancholic historiography of sexuality and summon radical imaginaries of queer futures? Those of you wishing to find queerness in this talk through the materiality of lost objects aspiring to gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender identity forms, or even through archives that might somehow fold back into identity reforms, will find few treasures here. Rather, for me, the Samaj's archives more radically offer a challenge to the lineages through which reproductive futurities constitute their authority. Here, the return to a history of sexuality is not through a call to loss of object or material, but rather through radical abundance, through an archive that is incommensurable and quotidian, imaginative and ordinary. Far from coupling archival accumulation with straightforward historical visibility, the Samaj's story challenges and indeed undermines the very idea and entelechy of an archive. Bypassing the demands for recuperation and reparation, remember, we need to preserve and we need to prove evidence of our minoritization. The Samaj's archive stubbornly enact queer readings that unsettle the link between historical reproduction and archival preservation. Radical abundance here is presence without return, or the fear of loss. Keenly aware of what archives cannot not deliver, what their evidentiary forms foreclose in their celebrated endorsement of rights and representation, the plenitude of the Samaj opens up the question of how we record histories of sexuality in many different keys. Thus, the orchestrated refusal of the Samaj to conform to representational archival forms embraces the very paradox it engenders. The archive remains a central value form, even as its radical transformation is demanded. Now, to conclude, I began my talk with the summoning of a historiography of sexuality that eschews the language of loss as the structuring mode of its narration. What we have here in the archives of the Samaj is a story that stubbornly refuses to move on from the ordinary plenitude of sexuality. In this story, archival surplus, we have so much, repeats itself in a historical calculus so minor, so unspectacular, that it does not appear to excite historical recuperation. No one has written about these materials. The archives of the Samaj have not been read, circulated, or memorialized beyond a repeated reference to the glories of the Samaj. Everyone talks about the success of the Samaj, nobody wants to think about the content of the Samaj. Such a historical elision is particularly telling because there is no mystery surrounding access to the archives, no governmental bureaucracies to accommodate. Shorn of the aura of loss and oppositionality, we are confronted with a historiography that refuses to give up the paradoxes instantiated in its self-archiving. Presence without preservation, production without reproduction. What remains then is the promise and failure of archival recuperation, the looking for, and a queer historiography about found objects that are so plentiful that one must look askance. Thank you. So these are part of, these are what are called khareed patra, which is basically bills of sale, came from the late 18th, early 19th century, where women were sold to these patrons, both men and women. And in one of these khareed patra, what one of the women does is she uses the occasion of the khareed patra to also write her own history. So forms like Mrityupatra, wills, are also used in these archives not to distribute property, but to distribute life stories. So this is one example. And so the left side is in Portuguese, the right side is in Konkani, which is the language of the archives. So the archives have 5 different languages: Kannada, Portuguese, Konkani, Marathi, and Modi, which is a language between Sanskrit and Hindustani. So anyway, I will more go more stuff, and I'm happy to obviously answer any questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Anjali. Wonderful talk. I'm sure there are questions. We have a lot of students of history in the room.
I'm happy to answer any questions. No question is
Is it
not
just
a good
clarifying?
question. Yes,
I
I
understand.
absolutely happy to do that. Yes.
Thank you, Anjali, for this. My question is less about the history and more about the future, in the sense that when I think about Pakistan right now and how we're at least talking about sexuality and how difficult it is to talk about it, to live it, and how, given the archival research, how important do you think is it for us to record these stories? I mean, obviously it's an essential thing, but how do we go about it? What are the different ways that we can actually record these queer lives? Because obviously the state is in no way going to record them because it is a criminalization and the whole way sexuality is looked at. So what are the ways we can go about it? Because because at some point, this moment right now is also going to be a part of the past. And it's not like that this epoch in Pakistan's time should be thought of as one that is unqueer, because there is queer existence here. There is multiple sexualities existing there. How do we preserve that? So somebody, decades later, can look back just at the time before British Raj to get the answers about how sexuality played out, but also within this moment.
I think in some ways you've answered your question yourself. I think the reason I work on a different era, but of course the questions I'm asking are hopefully applicable to thinking about recording or thinking about, as you said, archiving one's history. I think what I'm trying to do with this project, and that applies to your question, is to get people out of the sense of paucity and out of the scarce resource model. And those of us particularly who are in humanities or who think about sexuality, we're always worried about losing and not holding on. And I think what I'm trying to do, and I did this in my first project as well, is to try to think about sexuality as something that exists in counterintuitive places. Right? So yes, one needs to record. For example, I'll give you an example that this is not just about sexuality, it's about most communities. So I have a very good friend, Ram Revat, who's a Dalit historian. And when I exchanged my early paper to him, I published a bunch of this stuff, he said, Anjali, this is what Dalit people were doing and continue to do, is they write and circulate materials in genres that are not recognized as archives. Right? So yes, you need to do digitalizing, you need to do oral histories, you need to do all of those things, but you also need to create places where people actually read and engage those materials. Right? So for example, one of the interesting things about this archive, I've been working on it for a very long time, is that they refuse to digitalize their materials. And it's not because they don't have resources. You think, yeah, right? What's going on? And I've been harassing them for many years. After all, they said, okay, stop harassing us, we'll give you the money. But then I thought, why do I want to digitalize? I want to digitalize for the reasons you're saying. But they don't want people to digitalize because they want people to come and do, as they say, time pass in their archives. They want you, because the archives are bullshit, right? You read them, they're nonsense. The fiction is really bad, but they created the archive so that people would have a sense of ownership about a place and would bring people together. Right? So I think when we think about recording, and that's why I'm interested in historiography, is because it's about figuring a way to be present. Right? But how do we be present without thinking about invisibility? But rather think about presence that's there multiply. We just have to find a way to flag it, to think about it, right? So I feel like, especially this generation where there's a surplus of evidence, right? There's a plenitude of evidence. But think about it, in the United States where black people are being beaten, incarcerated, there's photographic, video evidence, but yet the police people are not being persecuted, right? So evidence is not really helping us, right? We have to think about a different way about how we do evidence. Just to get rid of these identitarian markers, right? Which is, again, not to say that gay, lesbian, transgender life, and the list goes on, are not always living lives of precarity. Remember, I'm not saying there's no loss. I'm saying, what would it mean to only be marked by loss? That's the queer future we want, right? Otherwise, we remain in the shadows of invisibility and refuse these magnificent... That's why I'm not writing about a queer, queer community. Right? Because the ways in which this archive teaches me to read is profoundly queer. Right? It refuses reproductive futurity. That's what queer futurity is not. Right? So when we record, you want to think about what is it, if I'm just recording this, then how am I going to get people to read it? How is it going to endure? Does it reproduce the very structures that I'm trying to get out of? Right? So I would encourage you to continue to do all of that. We really need to be better at interrogating what are the forms through which we memorialize our lives, right? And all the people in this room reflect different versions of that. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I feel like we need to unlearn a little bit, right? Unmore is the word I would say, you know, the thing that's holding us down, which is very hard, right? So in some ways, this project for me is infinitely more queer than my first book, which was on homosexuals, right? Because it was more literal. This is more about the literariness, right? The imaginative possibilities that a queer subject or in content and form offers for us. So, and yes?
So just taking what you said, taking it back, wouldn't it be some relative history or what about the authenticity of it? Fill in the gaps and you look at the, like you pointed out, the paradox. So the archives are not completely reliable, as you say. So what about the authenticity of the past events?
But there is no authenticity, right? Anyone who's a historian will tell you, and my dear friend David Gilmartin is there. Even historians who are very, very hard to persuade to give up their trade with their knowledge, right? That's what subaltern studies did in a good way, right? Across the board, is they reminded us that we're working with the traces of history, not history as it was, right? So the form that is, but what I'm also saying is that even though we know that, why is it that for gay, lesbian, trans communities, we still demand authenticity, right? So for example, Section 377, which I wrote about in my first book, before it was repealed, the courts in India demanded evidence of sexuality in India's past. So Janta went around a flora and fauna search, and yahan film make hai, book make hai, right? So, because why they had to like put together evidence. Now, the people are not going around saying I'm gay, right? Or, so authenticity is already a very troubled form. But even though we know it's troubled, intuitively, if I tell any of you authenticity is troubled, like, yeah, of course it is, right? One day I'm gay, tomorrow I'm straight, yesterday I was queer, whatever, right? And you should do whatever you like, right? We know that intuitively, but why do we not translate it historiographically? When it comes, we are more earnest, more self-righteous, right? And I'm interested in the kala, the playfulness, but yet the politics. This is not an archive that's not deeply about politics, right? It's about caste humiliation, it's about extreme degrees of degradation that have to be overcome. And what does this guy do and these women do? They say, look, let's make up our own shit, right? They want us to be abject, let's be abject. Right? So again, it's playful, but it is very serious at the same time, which is what else is queerness, right? When I teach literature, my students always ask me, what is a queer poem? Right? And I say, well, a queer poem is a poem that fancies other poems. So that's what that's. Okay, I'll get fired for that.
So you're also not saying that we are marked only by abundance. Can we be marked both by loss and by abundance?
Yes, I think we are always marked by loss. I mean, look around you. Lums is a sanctuary in a context of incredible loss, right? Of course, there's always loss, but I'm saying the loss is the condition of possibility. You can't get out of it, right? And what I'm saying to you is that if the origin story, if we begin with loss, we're always going to end up there, right? We're going to try to fill it with things. So this is a lot of materials, but they're filled with nothing, right? This biography, which is supposed to be the memoir of someone's life, is full of a made-up event, right? So we have plenitude, but it doesn't give us presence in any reliable way, right? In fact, makes it unbalanced. So I'm not saying replace loss with abundance. I'm saying they're both actually the same thing, but abundance allows us to not live lives of abjection within historiographical modes, right? That's part of the point. And this is not something radical that I am saying. If you look at work done by indigenous studies scholars, for example, in places like North America, in Australia, in India, a lot of these folks are saying the same thing, that we're tired. We're tired of being saying, we're tired of constantly being saying we're devalued, we want to procure value. We already always have had value, we just need different reading practices. Right? So this is not that's why I think as queer people, we need to move out, right? We need to align with other political projects that open up, right, our ways of reading and thinking. But it's a good question, thank you. Yes, please.
So, even though you say that the politics of this mark is not a core issue, but did it ever work with the ideas of Period or Ambedkar or Savitribai?
Yes, of course, they worked with them in that they mimicked them. So for example, the Samaj Sudharak, the journal that you saw, takes the Periyar was publishing his Satyashodhak Samaj, the RSF, they were all publishing journals at the time. So they take the stylization of the journal and reproduce it. So they have op-ed based, letter to the editor, lagu khatas, circulate. So they use all of those genres, but they fill them with stuff. So for example, a standard Samaj Sudharak would have this editorial that says we should reform ourselves, we need to educate ourselves, and then the right side would be an image of a woman playing a prostitute in a Hindi film, right? So there was, so they were in conversation. They were very aware of what they needed to look like in order to be taken seriously as a lower caste community. But part of the, I think, the project was that they emerged from very different caste histories because they came from Goa, Portuguese India, right? The British's relationship with caste was very different than the Portuguese. So their relationship to coalitional politics was very different. This community is very radical in that they have, they have continued processes of education, created charitable trusts, women's organization. Not all of the community has done well, but tons of them in rural and areas that are still living in systems of caste humiliation, right? So let me give you an example of a politics. This is a good story of maybe even another way. It's a very small part of the community lives in Karnataka, which is in western India, right? They speak Kannada there. So I went to do some archival work there, and I went to a group meeting, which was a big meeting, and because it's India, and if they know anybody who's doing research, they usually say you must give a speech, right? So I'm standing giving my sad speech about how great their materials are, etc. Then I look behind me, and in Kannada, there's a big banner that says Gomantak Saraswat Samaj. Remember, the Samaj is called Gomantak from Goa, Maratha Samaj. Now, Saraswat means Brahmin. If you go to India and you say I'm Saraswat, they'll say you're a Brahmin. So I was a little unnerved by that, but I finished my little speech, and then I turned to the president who had invited me, and I said, what's going on, right? You guys are not Saraswat. Why are you saying you're Saraswat? Because people are going to think you're Brahmins. And he said to me, look, Beta, look. And at the side, there was an image of the goddess Saraswati, who's the goddess of learning. And he said, look, unke bhakt hai. Follow them, so we are Saraswats. Gomantak Saraswat. So, but it's not illegal, right? So, who knows what will happen in the records? 20, 100 years from now, someone sees the Gomantak Saraswat Samaj, they will think it's a Brahmin Samaj, but it will be filled with this content. What is more brilliant and political than that? Right? Linda, you want to please.
Thank you for the talk.
My pleasure. Mention one.
I want to ask you what the Devdas community limited to the Portuguese India, and what was the difference in the British rule and the Portuguese rule?
That's a very, very good question. So the Devdasi community was not restricted to Portugal. It was restricted, it was all over South Asia. So it was in India, in what is now India, Sri Lanka, Burma, a little bit in Pakistan. Because remember, there were Hindus in Karachi, right? So we forget who lived very happily and were not persecuted, and in Lahore as well. So, but in southern India, which is where the predominant, those Devdasis were primarily performers of dance. They were also courtesans, but their kala, their art, was dance. And the British also established anti-Devdasi laws in the 1930s to abolish this tradition because they thought of it as prostitution. The difference in Portuguese India is that the Portuguese state did not interfere because they thought it was connected to religion, right? And they were less concerned with entering traditional practices. They thought of this as religion. So that's a big difference. And the second big difference is that this community endures to this day, whereas all the other Devdasi communities have been reformed or rehabilitated by the state because they tend to be very poor and come from very, very rural areas. So the difference of this community is its ability to stay alive, but also move around and establish itself. But if you talk to any feminist who works in South Asia, they love to say Devdasis, right? Because if you say Devdasis are good people, you're a good feminist, because you're saying, look, they're not just prostitutes, they're artists, etc. I'm saying they're prostitutes and artists, and what's wrong with that? That's the big difference, right? So, any other questions? Observations?
Hi, thank you for that. And I found particularly, so I want to tag on to the question asked in front about abundance and loss, and in terms of what kind of political project would that be? And I want you to just talk a little bit about that, because my own work is in a completely different context, but this kept reminding me of a conversation about one minority community within Lahore who was actively wanting the label of victim, because it translates when you come to the state and you have to present those documents, it means something in terms of what you can claim. Whereas the academics in the conversation we were having said, we're sick of this victim category and we want to instead talk about the ways in which they are empowered. And so that conflict made me think, is this abundance versus loss thing for the private space? Is it how we should write? And what is your political project?
I think that's a difficult question because you're asking about nomenclature that's attached to power, right? So if I say victim or survivor, if I say gay or queer, if I say trans or two-spirited, etc., etc. So I think, yes, there is values. What I'm interested in is how does a term or a word or a legal, in my case, historical archives, how do they accrue value? How do they get seen as places we can go to get something, right? And so when I'm thinking of abundance, I'm basically trying to say is that what if we understand where we get value from and then create those things so that we can accrue value, right? Which is a different orientation to just saying I'm a victim or survivor. And so the questions that I'm asking are of course more relevant for people who work in the past, but of course they translate into, so let me give you an example, right? So if you go to, and this absolutely happens everywhere in Pakistan as well, I can bet you, right? Is you go to places in like where I live in Bombay, where next to us we have a huge slum dweller. It's very, very big, but they use all of the state's electricity, everything, and hook them up with internet and get all of that free, right? But they routinely also go to the state and demand, right? So like, hamare paas electricity nahi hai, vagara, 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 right? So they use, it's like jugaad, right? They use what they have to get more, but to get more, they have to say we have nothing. Which doesn't mean they don't have anything. Of course they don't have anything. But they do have creativity, they have ways of, accruing value in places that should not have value, right? So for example, if you look at the word sodomy, right? Which literally means so do my neighbors, right? But that's another story. Or as we say, straight up and lie down, but that's but sodomy, look at the term sodomy. It goes to your victim narrative thing, right? So sodomy is a term that emerges in the 16th century and it refers to Jews, not to homosexuals. It refers to Jews because they are seen as accruing value in places where you should not have value. And then that translates to things like anal sex, etc., right? And sodomy, remember, is not just that, but that's also another story. So I think what I'm trying to say is that yes, you're absolutely right. This kind of contestation of terms is important, but we have to think about how are we contesting the terms? Are we then finding another term to accrue value around, or rather saying, look, terms accrue value in different ways, right? And how do we create a kind of continuum? So sometimes it is good to say you're a victim, because it will produce value for the person who's a victim in a very different way compared to the state. And sometimes it's important to say, right? Which it doesn't mean that you are refusing the politics of that substitution. You're in fact saying, look, I'm aware of it, right? What back in the day, Guy Spivak called strategic essentialism, right? It's a version of that in many ways. I've not really answered your question, but we can talk more later.
Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering if you could, I know it's not something that really you're focusing on, but the ways in which this archive is read, and I mean here literally read. You referred that sort of attempt to digitize it and you ended up kind of reading it.
Right.
I'm wondering if there is some ways in which the reading of this archive itself is also a kind of queer practice.
Oh, absolutely.
Are there ways in which it is read that would kind of set it apart from how?
Yes, it is, and I think it goes back to what Omar started up in terms of space, right? So for example, I gave a talk about a couple of months ago at the National Librarian Association, like random people invite me, right? So, and they invited me because I work in archives. So I gave a different talk that it was about these materials, and some auntie in the audience said to me very anxiously, she said, well, do you put the book back where you found it? So first of all, like whatever. But it was a very good question. She's a subaltern librarian, and she was a white lady, and as a white lady, she didn't want to go to subaltern archive and rearrange it, right? She wanted to respect the space. Now, what is interesting about these materials is that they're in brick and mortar buildings, but they're all over the place. So I could put it back where I found it, but I won't necessarily find it in the same place. Right? And part of it, so there are massive rooms, there's no real library, they're everywhere, right? So you could just run into them. And these buildings are in very, very expensive areas of now Mumbai and Panji, right? So it's not as if, so that's part of the kind of performance of the archive as well, the queer practice. And the other thing that is interesting about it is the repetition with rupture, right? So you read materials, but they can be cut and pasted and reproduced 10 years later without any attribution, because they just want to fill the archives. Or you might run into something that's actually useful, right? So that's another way of thinking. And I think that's part of why they don't want to digitalize. So for example, I have a very good friend who works with the Maori community in New Zealand. They're trying to digitalize their materials. They have a very interesting way, they're called geotags. They've written very interesting algorithms where depending on where you log in from, you have to go through different corridors, firewalls, to get to the information. Right? So if you're logging in from New Zealand, then you have less hoops to jump. But if you're logging in from North America, you have to go through read these histories before you can access the object. Right? So there's ways in which people who work with platforms like the digitalization, but also trying to be creative. So this is not limited to text. A lot of people are trying to think about how do we digitalize the difficulty of access, right? And still open source. Yeah. Right? So that's a good, and there are people who've written about it, I'm happy to tell you about it. But so yes, absolutely, it's about the color of the archive, right? The queer practice of reading, which requires you to unmoor yourself from the idea of historical utility. I've got to make meaning out of this. That's why we go to archives, right? What did you find? Right? And did you save it? Literally. And my Ziploc bags didn't, right? And did you find evidence? And all of these things are there, but they are like Umar's futures. They're under erasure. So you put a line in it, means you see it's disappearing, but you can see traces of it still. Right? That's what it
I have another one. If that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Linda's the boss, so if she says it's okay, it is.
Can you say a little more about this distinction between the literal and literariness? How are they connected or not connected?
Well, they are connected in that the literal is the actual text. The literary is the rendition of the text as a figuration, meaning it's something that has to be within a particular practice, space, time, and orientation. So, for example, if I'm used to reading, I'll give you an example of an installation that a good friend, who's a very interesting and important artist in South Asia, Shiva Chachi, works in Kashmir. So she did an exhibition installation, this is about literary and literariness, where it was about, like you have the Shaheed Memorial here. It was basically to memorialize the folks who had died under military rule in Kashmir. So you enter this room, and it has gravel all over it, and the pictures of the people who are dead are in Quran kis mein rakhte hain? What is that? So Rahel mein the pictures there, but you have to kneel and look at the pictures. Right? So you are paying obeisance even as you're looking. That's a literary configuration of a literal object. Right? That would be an example. So what I'm trying to say is that the archive is a literary form because it has genres, but I mean, it has biographies, census records, all of the things that those of us who work in South Asia have spent years reading. Those are the genres of the archive. But the genres also have stylization. How do you know something is a ghazal? How do you know something is a haiku? Because they're stylization. So archival genres also have stylization, right? So paying attention to all of these forms is what I'm asking you to do.
Yeah. So I just want to talk about it the terminologies and the essence which is present in the society. Let's suppose we take the example of trans community in Pakistan. So there are very few, there is a very vast, you can see a spectrum of very vast terms in the culture. But as far as if we see this in preserving it to this historical point of view, so the people who are doing it, they have a limited this cultural essence within themselves to preserve it. So the real culture is still there. It not get preserved in that way. So like, there is this gap which we can maybe like, after 20 years or 25 years. So the present culture, if it get preserved, that will not be in the form which is presently right now. So like how you can see this gap?
I think you're asking an interesting question that I get asked quite a lot, right? Which is basically that the generation of today doesn't know the vast histories of the past, right? But I would say that the generations of every day did not have a sense of vast histories of the past, right? So instead of trying to fill the gap, why don't we think about little, tightropes that we can lay, where you walk back and forth. So for example, I'm thinking about the work of some colleagues who work on the transgender community in places like Hyderabad, right? And one of the things they've been trying to do is, instead of saying, let's also find examples of transgender peoples in different texts, in different templates, in different eras, why don't we start from thinking about what's happening in the present as an entirely different history? So instead of saying that's the origin and this is the result of that, think about them as multiple origin stories. Right? So you can't say, oh, pehle aise hota tha, ab aise hai. Right? That means you're saying we're not like that, or we are better than that. Instead, what they're doing is saying all of these stories are non-competitive histories. So instead of saying that was better and this is worse, or we were in the past, we were celebrated and now we're not, just think about them as simultaneous histories. That is a different way, so that it's not about constantly doing punitive stuff, right? Saying, I wish you're blaming young people for not knowing their history. But we don't know their history. I'm old, so I don't know the people of young people's history. So the question is, so that's what I would suggest. I mean, it's not a perfect answer, but I think we have to get out of the making up for the past and the present, because that gets us nowhere, right? You just end up alienating communities.
Any more questions? Anjali, can I ask you a
Yes,
question?
please.
So, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the contradiction between, this need to prove that you existed, to provide evidence, knowing full well that providing evidence might not get you justice or recognition that you want, but you're still driven to do that because of the way the power is operating.
Right.
At the same time, there's a danger of recording.
Right.
So there's a danger of keeping a record, taking photos or writing things down that are so, marginalized. So how do you deal with that contradiction?
Well, I think one of the ways in which these archives deal with it is that they record things in chimeric ways, in ways that are unreliable. So there is a lot of stuff in here which is about caste humiliation, right? So for example, my father, who wrote that editorial, I'm obviously from this collectivity, so my father has stories in these archives, because he was a poet, where he writes about being invited to a Brahmin's house and being asked to eat out of the plate from which the dog shat in, right? Caste humiliation. There are real stories of him, but they are blended in with a lot of different stories, right? So all the stories have equal value, right? So for example, this incident that I told you, yes, it's made up, it has a lot of value because it gave these people certain rights. So your question is not one I can answer, but I think one of the ways in which one can think about it is find a way to couple stories that are excruciating, or stories, particularly in terms of gender violence, etc., without, and putting them across or against other kinds of stories that also express violence, but in a different register. And this is a question that, I work for Majlis, which is an organization in Bombay that works on questions of gender violence. It's something we've thought about a lot, right? Because anonymity, all kinds of things are very important too. But to find a way to not privilege, but we also don't want to privilege testimonials, right? So for example, you don't need to know somebody who has experienced gender violence to care about gender violence. So we also don't want to privilege those testimonials, but we also want them to be there, right? So I think it's like, I don't have an answer because your question is too hard, but I think what you're asking is that we need a better kind of narrative legal structure to record and unrecord at the same time, right? We're not quite there yet, but I think there's a lot more awareness, like your audit march, for example. You know it has limited scope, but it's very important to do it, right? Despite the what happened afterwards, etc. So, but I'm not really answering your question. I need to think about it some more.
Okay, one last question maybe from Sadia.
Can you talk a little bit about whether or not you think about the response capacity in terms of the ways that you were thinking about?
Wait, say that to the last part again.
I was wondering if you were interested in or felt that there was any like variation in terms of the way that you're arguing about the Samajas archive that's accessible, it's being limited to a certain site, refusal of digitization. What fluidity is also a refusal of certain kind of transparency.
To inhabit transparency.
Well, no, so I'm thinking basically of the response capacity and whether you see that in any way, whether you see some of the things that you're talking about in any way in conversation with his advocacy for opacity as opposed to transparency.
Yeah, sure. But I think opacity in a way not to refuse meaning, but to make you work harder at getting to meaning. Right? So it's important to remember, because if you think about Gayatri Spivak's work, people always say, oh, why does she have to write so complicatedly, right? But she's writing complicatedly because she wants you to work hard at getting to meaning, rather than just make you work hard, right? So I think, yes, absolutely. I think that's definitely at place here. I would not call it opacity, but I'm not wedded to a term. You know, I would call it a thickness of reading instead of a thinness of reading, which would allow for the same kinds of things. So I think we're saying the same thing, but in a different register.